Welcome to another edition of Life's Journeys with Dr. Ralph Smith. A lot of the issues will be addressed on these programs, but perhaps the one issue that has come through all of my 100 and some odd years of life, I'm only joking, I'm 62, but the last 100 years of life have been the issues of substance abuse. The reasons vary. Substance abuse can be considered an escape of not dealing with life's realities, and the substance allows you, whether it be alcohol, drugs, or whatever, as an escape to kind of remove yourself from the world and enjoy this supposed high. Well, here's the problem with that supposed high. You got to come back to reality. And so while you're out using your drugs or you're out using substance as far as alcohol, you always got to come back to the original problem. If you don't solve a problem, it's not going to disappear. So at the very most, it gives you a temporary, let's say, relapse of reality. And the reality relapse is enjoy the drugs, enjoy the substance, and then come back and still have to deal with real world. So in this program, we're going to explore all the elements of substance abuse. We're going to deal with the use of marijuana, now legalized in Washington. We're going to deal with meth. The Detective Brian is going to share with you stories that I think will really shock you in the fact that the legalization of marijuana has not decreased nor increased our drug problem. It's still a big problem. We're going to deal with the issues of heroin. That's a drug that was used years and years ago and how it's regained its popularity. And then we're going to deal with the drug that has the most devastating effect, that is meth. And the whole point of meth is, again, it's an escape. It doesn't make people bad people, but it's an issue of release. And then we're going to also deal with this issue of, is this a matter of choice or is this a disease? So stay tuned. I think you're going to pick up a lot of interesting information, and more importantly, if you recognize these problems in your family, reach out for help. We'll be right back. In the previous segment, we had talked a little bit about some of the dangers of substance abuse and some of the areas that you need to watch for, kind of like a checklist. But we're joined here by Detective Brian once again, and we're talking about substance abuse real life. And by real life, I mean, not anybody will tell you, well, I want to be on drugs, or I don't want to, I like to drink a lot of alcohol. Most people use it as an escape. So what we're going to talk about is we're going to trace this substance abuse issue all the way from the beginning on how it comes about, how available it is. There's been a lot of controversy about marijuana being legal for recreational use in the state of Washington. A lot of questions, even nationwide, have been raised about that and how Washington and Colorado is doing their job. But what we want to do in this segment is to try to educate you on the dangers of substance abuse. And we'll have an example, fictitious person we'll name Tommy, and how Tommy goes through the aging process dealing with substance abuse. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, welcome back again, Brian. I know we talked before about domestic violence in a previous show, but now we're dealing with substance abuse, and in a way those two issues can intertangle sometimes, but let's just deal with substance abuse itself. How big a problem do we have with substance abuse in Calhoun County, and what efforts are being made on behalf of the law enforcement agencies, not only to enforce our laws, but to kind of deal with this type of problem?
Well, it depends on what kind of substance it is, but I would say that heroin and meth are two of the big problems in our community here, and it's really breaking up quite a few families and causing a lot of heartache throughout our community. And so things that we attempt to do are like community policing programs, talking to the community, educating them on ways that, well, I guess that doesn't really address the substance abuse, but what fuels the property crimes as a result of substance abuse is how I should.
And that is a big issue, because people think about it and they think, well, if you're in a typical middle income family and you have extra money, you just go out to find the local pusher, and I'm making it sound simpler than it really is, and you go ahead and buy your drugs. Right. Well, unfortunately, drug use, and especially drug use to the point of being illegal, is just unacceptable. But we have folks out there that maybe can't make a living, or because of their drug addiction are not able to hold down a regular job. So you have to wrestle with the fact as a community, even though it ends up being your job in law enforcement, right, but as a community, well, how are these people going to get the money to get these drugs?
Right.
So maybe that's where we should start in this conversation. what are the type of things that are caused that could affect our average citizen in Clallam County in order for these people to get their drugs? In other words, to convert those possessions into money.
Okay.
So how do you kind of manage through that?
We're really limited in what we can do. However, I personally believe that it starts with that initial contact with that person and treating them like anyone else. Just because they have a substance abuse addiction doesn't mean they're not a person. So treating them like that and letting them know that, hey, if you don't change your practices, using these drugs, this is what's going to happen to you. You're going to be a customer, and I hate to say it like that, but you're going to be a customer of mine for years to come. Is that really what you want for yourself? So sometimes that first contact is the most important. But as far as programs that are available, not really, not until they have committed that crime, that programs become available, and that's the unfortunate truth.
Well, let's talk about drug use without mentioning names, because we don't want to have our attorneys make a bunch of money here. But let's talk about drug abuse here in Clallam County. And it's like I've mentioned before in previous shows, it's a huge county. We go all the way to Forks, Washington, the beautiful Pacific Ocean, all the way through where we hook up in the Hood Canal Bridge with Jefferson County. So there's a diverse population, spread out, different occupations. You got business occupations, you got farming, you got a lot of different, so a good intermix there. What is the number one drug that we have to fight in this county that's given us the most problem?
I think it's heroin, but meth is a close second.
It is. And of course, with meth, if they tend to have their own meth labs, that creates a whole nother danger too. Right. And a lot of people are not aware of that, but those can be very, very dangerous. So do you tend to find people that have these meth labs, let's say, out in the wilds of Clallam County, where you have to use a dirt road to get to them? Do you find that you've got two problems there, is the creation of the product and then also the product of use?
Well, actually, we don't see very many meth labs anymore. And in fact, I think the last time I saw a meth lab in Clallam County was about 10 years ago.
Wow, that's great news.
And that's because the price of meth is so much cheaper to get it from Mexico than it pretty much, it would cost more to have your own lab and create it, and all the restrictions with all the Sudafeds and the drugs and the chemicals that it takes to create meth is so expensive, and that it's just cheaper to get it from Mexico.
That's interesting, because I know in Idaho, where I'm from, we had many shows on these meth labs and how dangerous they were. And we found these meth labs in very well-to-do communities, as we refer to people who lived up in the hills overlooking Boise Valley or Treasure Valley at the time. And it was purely financial. In fact, most of the bust, again, I went on a few ride-alongs with the Ada County Sheriff Department, those people didn't even use it. It was purely money to them.
The dealers?
The dealers, yeah,
right.
the production. So if you got this flow coming up from Mexico, or whatever, the southern flow as we call it, then that kind of kicks it out as far as the production's concerned, which then would hopefully eliminate the need for production and also for distribution, right? If it's just mainly users.
Well, we have a drug task force, and they're dedicated to drug crimes.
Okay.
So they are targeting more of the main level dealers in our community. They also work well with federal agencies because it is all tied in with the I-5 corridor and the meth that's coming up from Mexico through that way. So the task force attacks, it from that angle by the use of informants and so on to investigate these drug cases and implement or execute arrests from their standpoint as a result of their investigations. However, as far as the user is concerned, again, it really comes down to they have to essentially commit a crime before there's any programs that are available, unless they pay for it out of their own pocket or their family can pay for the help that's needed or the treatment. But essentially, they have to commit a crime, and once they commit a crime, so long as they don't have an extensive criminal history, then there's drug court, which is offered through Clallam County courts. And I've been told, I don't know I've never seen the numbers in front of me, but I've been told that it has about a 50% success rate.
That's good.
Right, and the
really
drug
very
court is in lieu of the criminal charges. So if they complete the drug court program, I'm not qualified to speak on it, but I understand that that will help alleviate some of those criminal charges, or at least adjust them.
But of course, if you reoffend in that program, you go through the normal channels then.
Absolutely.
You've got one shot at this to kind of clean your act up.
Oh, I would beg to differ. I've seen people get multiple chances.
Really?
Yes.
That's amazing. Now, heroin, which is also referred to as horse, has been around forever. Even when I was in high school, it was there. Now, LSD was very popular back then, the mushrooms, cocaine was available, all those things. One of the arguments that was made, and I'd like your professional opinion on this, or your personal opinion, whatever you're most comfortable in, is that with the legalization of marijuana, that would take the dealer out of the game, to where a lot of times people refer to these dealers as the marijuana or the grass being a gateway drug, where they go in and buy it, and maybe in their own minds it's more acceptable, versus now it's legal for recreational use with certain restrictions. Have you noticed that the incidence of drug abuse has gone down since the marijuana has been legalized here in the state of Washington? Has it stayed the same? How do you read that?
No, I don't have any statistics or data to prove otherwise, but I have not seen any decrease in drug use. I mean, meth and heroin still remain very high in Clallam County, and therefore we're having a lot of property crimes as a result.
Now, as far as law enforcement driving vehicles, as far as arresting people driving vehicles, they have a certain test they have for alcohol. It's been around forever. It's .08. And again, people, based on male or female, whether you eat or not, it metabolizes different ways. But in marijuana, isn't there a separate test that you can test the driver of a vehicle for marijuana? Or how do you handle that if you think they're under the influence of marijuana?
Right. Well, that all depends on the reasons for the initial traffic stop. If there's lane travel, weaving, there's been reports that it's an erratic vehicle, so on. So if we have good driving on the vehicle, and when I say good driving, it means we've observed poor driving, then we stop the vehicle. And if we're talking to someone and they have bloodshot eyes, bloodshot watery eyes, and slurred speech, or something's going on and they appear to be impaired, but we do not smell an odor of alcohol, we would still do the standardized field sobriety test to check their level of impairment. And that's just a test that for observation, for us to be able to determine how impaired they are. And if it appears that they're too impaired to drive, then at that point we would be looking at getting a search warrant, applying for a search warrant for blood, so that could be tested.
One of the obvious things, and most people who use marijuana recreationally, medically, or just for their own thrills may not realize, but marijuana has a peculiar odor to it.
Absolutely.
And it's like, if a law enforcement officer wasn't born with a nose, maybe it'd be a little bit difficult to tell, but it has a rather unique aroma to it. If you had that same stop and you could smell that aroma, and somehow they managed to pass the field sobriety test, what do you do then?
Well, there's a lot of factors that play into that. If the reason for the stop, if in your example, if there were no observations of poor driving, and we just merely stopped someone for another offense, i.e. a seatbelt violation, and we pulled that vehicle over and we contacted the driver and we smelled the odor of marijuana, we might ask some questions. Have you smoked any marijuana? Have you ingested any marijuana recently? And just in engaging them in conversation, if we notice any other indicators, like I said before, the bloodshot watery eyes, or just any signs of impairment, then we might ask them at that point to do some voluntary field sobriety tests. But in your example, you say if they pass those field sobriety tests, it would depend. How well did they pass? Were there any indicators at all? We'd probably look to, see if there's anybody that could come get them, if they would agree to anything like that, and of course we would let them know, the reason we're just trying to make our roadways safe. We don't want to see anybody get hurt. We don't want to see any other, you get hurt or anybody else. So most of the time it's an easy sell.
One other question on marijuana, and then we'll move to other drugs. A lot of folks have the attitude, and I don't know the difference, again, and I'm not a lawyer, but I don't know the difference between Colorado laws, Washington laws, now Oregon has stepped up. A lot of these states get involved with decriminalizing the use of marijuana, and then finally they might approve it for recreational use. But here in the state of Washington, what exactly does the law pertain? I think you have to be 21 to purchase it. You can use it for consumption within your own home, but you can't just sit out here on the park bench and use it. Why don't you walk our audience through a little bit about what this law allows people to do and what the law does not allow people to do?
Well, it's kind of parallels alcohol in the sense that you have to be 21 or older to use it, and you cannot ingest, or you should not ingest marijuana and drive a vehicle. But it's just like alcohol. You can't stand out on the street corner and drink beer in
Right.
open daylight. It would be the same thing.
Okay. So there's no difference there. So what about the hypothetical example of someone in the park and watching their kids play? Can they light up there and use marijuana without any type of enforcement angle, or is that a judgment call?
I would believe that there's a parks statute that covers that. Perhaps that you cannot smoke marijuana in the park or use drugs. I don't know though.
You know, it's fascinating, Brian, that you brought up that point, that the drug use and all that is still there and present, because there was one of the major arguments about the legalization of marijuana was the fact that it would take the dealers completely out of the equation. Now, I know from previous shows I've done, we have found that the state put so many taxes on it, and not, again, bringing you into the political part of this,
Right.
that sometimes going to those marijuana shops or cannabis shops or whatever they want to call them, it's actually more expensive than buying it from the pusher, who obviously doesn't charge state taxes.
Right.
Have you run into that much at all on the street?
No,
That's amazing.
marijuana has not been an issue.
That's just absolutely amazing.
From my standpoint, marijuana has not been an issue. The issue is methamphetamine and heroin.
Okay, we'll move into that. It's fascinating to me because, again, relating back to the Idaho example, is that there's been a lot of law enforcement between Moscow, Idaho, and Pullman. And let's say state troopers are well aware of the game being played on that highway of trying to keep University of Idaho students from bringing marijuana in from the Washington State University and all these type of deals. And it's really an ugly mess. But the thing that is fascinating to me is the fact that people still need to understand that even if you accept the analogy that alcohol and marijuana is the same, and I tend to feel that way myself, if there's anything you do that impairs your driving, you're not only putting yourself at risk and whoever's in that car, but that family that's coming in from the other direction, whose only mistake is they're in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Right.
How do you drive home that message?
Well, it's to be quite honest. I'll share a personal or an example. When I arrested someone and it was an alcohol DUI. And this person just was not getting the message. They were argumentative throughout the entire process of going through the breathalyzer machine. And I was getting frustrated too, because it is a timely process, and I knew that when I was finished with this, my report was going to be quite lengthy and it was going to take up a lot of my shift. And there were a lot of calls coming in, so I was a little bit stressed, and the gentleman just was not getting the message. And finally I told him, I turned over and I said, you know what, sir, it's a good thing you didn't kill anybody tonight, driving as impaired as you are. And my cousin died from a drunk driver.
Oh, Lord.
And he really changed his tone. He was cooperative. He told me sorry that I had lost someone in my family. And he, after I, went through the process and he went to jail, I remember my sergeant came up to me and asked me, hey, what happened to your cousin? I never heard about that. And I told him I made that up. I made that story
Just
up.
to get their
And
attention.
he said, why? And I said, because I wanted it to be personal.
Yeah, personalize it.
Absolutely. And I wanted them to realize that, it could happen. So let's personalize this.
Well, we do have drug courts. There's been a lot of advances there for the people that screw up and basically need another opportunity to find a wisdom to their way of living life.
Right.
But, there's another issue that's involving, substance abuse, and we'll switch over to alcohol. A lot of people, I think, do not realize how little alcohol it takes to violate the law. And growing up, it was 0.10. Most states now, it's 0.08. The courts have stepped up. They're now requiring alcohol education, which is a lot more successful. We do that ourselves at Jenny Marie instead of counseling. They have these victim panels where they can actually see the effects of what happens when a drunk driver. Some counties get real aggressive and they'll even take some people to the morgue and show the example of what can happen.
Right.
But here's the big point that I'm trying to make. Is there a common theme through all of this, from alcohol addiction to substance addiction, whether it be marijuana, meth, cocaine, heroin? How much is it related to the economy? And by that I mean, if financial resources are tight and jobs are not plentiful, and Calhoun County has one of the highest unemployment rates in the state of Washington, how much of that is an impact, either from the stress of not being employed or the actual reality that their whole family structure could be breaking apart because they don't have a job?
Right.
What type of a link do you see in that?
Well, I think it's a factor, but I think it really does come down. Well, there's so many factors that play into why people get into drugs or substance abuse, but you know, the economy could easily tie into that. The stressors of having bills and not being able to pay them. Or having mental health issues is another, you know, factor that causes people to get into street drugs. Or, but yeah, I could see it a factor, but I don't really notice. That's not a factor that's in the forefront as to why that I've seen in my job, as to why people resort to using street drugs.
Some of the people do it just because they enjoy it.
Some people do.
And it's a release. I mean, it used to be used in the early days when I started my education. It was like a merry-go-round. You know, we go to a merry-go-round, you go round, around, around, and then finally it has to stop sooner or later. You have to face reality.
Right.
And that's the part where, again, we have an interface with law enforcement.
Right.
Well, we need to take our quick break. When we return, we're going to talk about this hypothetical example of Tommy. And we're going to walk Tommy through from middle school years right up to years that he gets married, and how alcohol and substance abuse can affect that. And then we'll also spend some time talking about prevention and talking about solutions, because we're not only here to educate and talk about all the evils that, you know, substance abuse could bring, but we also want to provide some solutions. So people, if they take a note of what we talk about and they decide, I don't want to be a Tommy, they have a path that we'll lay out for them, okay?
Okay.
We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Life's Journeys with Dr. Ralph Smith. We're talking a little bit about substance abuse and really trying to give you an education of what's going on with substance abuse. Maybe things you should watch for in your own children. The legalization of marijuana, how that has affected us. But let's get a little bit more personal about it. And I've created a hypothetical example of Tommy. Tommy could have gone through a Jenny Marie clinic. Tommy could be somebody that I, found in the streets, as far as we do a lot of rehab in the streets. So I'm going to use that as an example. It's a fictitious person. So if your name's Tommy, you're running around doing these things, don't sue us, okay? Brian, dealing with the hypothetical example of Tommy, I have found in my history that people that tend to live in homes, and kids that live in homes that use drugs, in a sense it's kind of a approval for them to use drugs. Mm-hmm. And it kind of spreads. And where we tend to pick that up is in the middle schools. And so let's come up with this example of Tommy. And let's figure that he's in a middle school here, or a junior high school, whatever term you use. And let's give it an age bracket of 12 to 14. Share with us experiences that you've had with Tommies of the world and how you manage that at such a young age. And that could be drinking, it could be using drugs. We haven't talked about Oxycontin, we'll do that at the end, and some of these pain medications that people get addicted to. But it's just that kid who's in junior high and he's having issues with substance abuse, and whether it be drinking alcohol, using drugs, and he's 12 to 14 years old, what do you do?
Right. So typically we get these types of calls from the parent or guardian reporting that their Tommy is not showing up to school. They found, whether alcohol or marijuana in the backpack, or and there's been some, hanging out with other kids that are a little older, or and there's just been this kind of pattern of behavior that they've noticed, not showing up to school, not following the house rules, so on and so forth. So a lot of times what I like to tell parents is, if, first of all, is there someone in Tommy's life that Tommy respects, that he responds to, that he, because sometimes, as a parent or a guardian, because you're always the authority figure, that communication has broke down once you start counseling them on something. So finding, whether it be an uncle or maybe even a pastor at a church, or just someone that Tommy responds to, and find that person and see if maybe they can reach out to Tommy and say, hey, you need to stay away from this stuff. You need to stay away from this group of people, and you need to start going to school, because if you don't, this is what's going to happen to you. And if that doesn't work, and a lot of times we're called back to these types of situations more than once over a period of time, and usually about the second or third time, I will talk to the parent or guardian about using resources such as it's based out of the youth center. I can't remember the name of the program, but I would put them in touch with the youth center, the Clown County Youth Center, and it's basically a program that sets boundaries or provisions for the child that they have to abide by in the house. And the program's name will come to me just right now. I'm not thinking of it, but essentially it's a contract, and the kid has to abide by this contract, and if they don't, then they can be picked up on a juvenile warrant or a pickup order, where we would actually have the authority to pick that kid up and take him to the youth center, where they'd be incarcerated for a short period of time, and they would see a judge, and it's all about accountability. And I always tell parents that is the last resort. Don't use this, unless you absolutely have to, because, and my personal opinion is that once you label a kid as, a criminal, or they go through that process where they're incarcerated, that can have damaging effects later on.
Well, I think a lot of parents would use that as a fear factor, but the reality is if the child has problems, and you throw them in with a bunch of other kids who have problems,
Absolutely.
It kind of feeds on itself.
I agree.
Which raises the question, before we promote Tommy into high school, how big a factor is peer pressure in that age bracket from 12 to 14? Or is it more or less an outbreak of an unhappy home? What are the factors you find when something like that occurs?
Well, I think it starts in the home. I really do, because if a home is like your support system, and if you don't have a good guide, a parent or a guardian or someone to lead you in the right direction, then you don't have a good example. But that's not necessarily true in all cases. Sometimes there are good parents, and they do try to provide a good home and stable environment for their child, and yet they still resort to it. So in those circumstances, absolutely, it's peer pressure. It's that child getting involved with a group of kids, or seeing something that they want to emulate, and they just participate in it.
Tommy gets into high school. Hallelujah. He's sitting there as a junior, maybe a year and a half to get that high school diploma. But also, as he advances, he gets older, he starts going to parties, which maybe would not be as common as junior high. He starts attracting toward people that are maybe less desirable. And I'm not talking about their looks and economic brackets. I'm talking about their release valves, what we call in psychological trade, which means things they do to, quote, relieve the pressure of life.
Right.
And it's always hard for parents to understand that, because as a parent, you're going out and making a living, you're trying to raise kids, you want to get the mortgage paid, you think about retirement, and yet these kids get under this pressure, as they call it.
Mm-hmm.
What happens to Tommy when he gets to that level? Let's say he's starting to use drugs, or you bust a party out there in some campground where drugs are being used. Do you go ahead and then finally go to the situation of arresting and putting them through the criminal process? Or is this still the type of philosophy you take the kid back home?
Well, and same type of philosophy, and the program that I was talking about through the youth center is called the Youth at Risk program.
Okay.
And it's the same type of thing. We will contact the parents if they're still a juvenile under the age of 18. We'll contact the parents and say, hey, you need to come get your kid. And it's the same thing, like minor in possession, cases where kids are partying, And we have a friendship diversion program. However, I don't think it's in effect anymore, but I think it's still, the ideologies behind it are still in effect. And that is that they get an opportunity to go through a program, whether it be a class or, it's something set up by the prosecutor's office that if they follow through with this program, whether it be community service or what have you, then they won't have the minor in possession on their record.
Okay.
But again, just like any other thing that we do in law enforcement, it's that first contact with that kid, and maybe the second and third. But talking to that kid, trying to reach them and let them know that, hey, if you continue down this path, you're going to end up, with a felony on your record. You're going to end up with, warrants, and you're going to end up in our jail, in big boy jail. And sometimes, I don't know how much effect it has, but just trying to have that positive influence on everyone that we deal with, whether it be an adult or a kid, and try and have that positive impact and let them know that, hey, you continue down this path, this is what it's going to turn out for you. And we try to, despite their disagreements with their parent or guardian, or the issues they're having at home, talking to them about, resolving conflict is an important part of being an adult. Talking to your parents and working through the conflict is that's most important. And if you're running away from it and you're constantly trying to run away from your problems by engaging in using drugs or hanging out with these people that have a lengthy criminal record, it's going to cause you more problems down the road. But learning to stand up and face conflict in a constructive way and work through it, that's going to make you a productive member of society one day. And so I think that's an important message to pass along, especially a juvenile.
The incidences, again, of substance abuse, do you juveniles, and we used to call it juvie and juvenile detention. I guess they always change words. As we get older, they just change the terms. It's the same thing. Do you find that they tend to abuse alcohol more than regular drugs? Or does it seem like they use whatever's most convenient? Because sometimes alcohol is more readily available, maybe not to purchase at a local store because they're well aware of losing that license is pretty expensive.
Right.
But what do you find in dealing, again, with a Tommy age person, 16, 17 years old? What do they tend to abuse the most?
Well, I think you're right on with alcohol, and I think that is because it's the easiest to access, whether they steal it or they get someone of age to purchase it for them. But it also depends on their social circle. I mean, if they have connections, and when friends or people in their group that have access to drugs, then so it depends on the kid, but the common denominator is alcohol.
As an offender, and let's say that Tommy goes into drug court, cleans himself up, and he's ready to move on to college and go into that experience, has himself a GED, has a high school diploma, whatever the case might be. Do you tend to notice that the Tommies of the world and the people that you relate to, that as they age, do they tend to have a better chance of surviving this and moving on and being productive citizens? Or do you tend to see a pattern just keeps growing even though they may be getting older?
No, and making sure that I understand your question. The people that have turned their lives around,
Right.
That they continue down the right path, absolutely. I wish I could see more of that in this line of work, because that is really what pushes me and drives me to continue in this job that can be really stressful at times. But there are a few of people that I've either arrested or had contact with in a law enforcement capacity that have turned their lives around. They've turned away from the drugs and they're doing great. They're productive members of society, and now they have built their own support systems. They've created a life for themselves, and what I always tell them is, you broke the cycle, because more times than not, a lot of these kids that grow up and they resort to the substance abuse or resort to substance abuse are coming from an environment where there is substance abuse.
Right.
And that's the unfortunate truth. But
Well, I think it happens. They kind of look at it
So-
as it's like the norm.
Absolutely.
I mean, if
And
you're
so-
living in a home and you're hearing arguments and fights and money's hard to come by, and you're late
Absolutely.
for the rent, and folks are drinking themselves to go to sleep.
Right.
If you're observing that,
So
how else would you,
absolutely.
look at it?
So
I mean,
what do I, how I explain that to them is, break the cycle. Break the cycle that you have seen, your parents or, your family has provided an example for you. That's what you're blessed with, is that they've provided an example for you of what not to do.
correct.
So now, you create your own destiny. And once they do, they broke the cycle, and it's just a great thing to see. It's really rewarding to see that when it happens.
Well, in our segment of conversation, let's assume that Tommy finally woke up, found the perfect woman, and moved out to the suburbs and raised a great family. Let's assume the positive here. But a part of the substance problem that's generally not discussed, and which I find in my practice to be even more evident than the issues with juveniles, is the issue of painkillers.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of adults, and I'm sure you run across this, whether it be Oxycontin, whether it be Valium, whatever the drug might be, they can start off with a prescription, and they have a certain amount of pills to take care of the pain, and those drugs are highly addictive.
Absolutely.
And even though you're carrying the prescription bottle, and you can go ahead and show the law enforcement officer that you have a prescription, all that, sooner or later, if that pain issue is not resolved, a doctor will normally start reducing the amount of prescriptions or reducing the amount of pills, and then it aggravates the problem. How big an issue is that in Calhoun County? Where we're talking about we don't really, I don't like to refer to it as suburban, but let's say we have a city or a suburban wife who just has an addiction of Oxycontin because she hurt her back or whatever. Do you run into much of that out there?
Absolutely.
And how do you do? What do you do about
Well, when I started, 11 years ago, that was a huge problem, prescription pill abuse. But what was happening is the younger generation was breaking down the pill to smoke it,
Mm-hmm.
or break it down to ingest it in some way, shape, or form. And that was a huge issue. However, and I don't know how many years it took, maybe 3 or 4 years after that. The way I understand it is the pharmacy industry, they realized the problem, and I think it was an epidemic sweeping the nation at the time. I may be wrong about that, but it was definitely affecting our county. And so they affected the time release agent in the pill, so it made it more difficult to have the same effects of ingesting a synthetic narcotic, because that's what these pills are.
Right.
And so as a result of that, the pills lost their value, of course, and so a lot of these prescription pill addicts were just switched straight to street heroin.
Mm-hmm.
But going back to examples of people that have been in a serious injury or collision or something, they've had a serious injury and they're prescribed these prescription narcotics. Absolutely, I've seen that quite a few times where people have started out on prescription narcotics and got addicted to them, and then it wasn't enough for their addiction, so they turned straight to street heroin, or their doctors were trying to wean them off, but I haven't seen that as often as I would like to see.
Well, we're going to do a separate program later on, probably out of swim, and talking about Grandma and Grandpa's drug cabinet and how it gets raided by the kids when they're visited by their grandkids and things. It's a huge problem. People don't like talking about it, but it's a real problem.
Well, one program that we do have in Clallam County is the drug take-back program, which is a safe place. It's right in the sheriff's office lobby, that people can bring old prescription pills, and there's a drop box, so nobody has to give their name, anything like that. It's kind of like an anonymous. You just show up, drop it in there. So that's another angle that we've kind of approached that issue.
That's a big
to
step
alleviate
forward.
that.
Do you have kids, Brian?
I do. I have one.
You have one? How old?
Yes. She just turned 6.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wait till you hit puberty. We'll have to do another show. You'll be grayer then.
Oh, great.
But to finally, to kind of summarize what we're talking about here today, and again, thank you for your help on the domestic program and the substance. I'd like you to look in the camera and just give advice, because you're a parent, and that obviously is our most important job in the world, without a doubt. Give these parents advice and suggestions that before they hit the front line of our defense, which is law enforcement officers, that you would advise to a parent to get ready for this stage and not wait till their kids get older. Is there some advice you'd like to share?
Well, if you as a parent are having a child that's experiencing or exhibiting behavior that, such as delinquency from school, hanging out with the wrong group, and it appears that they're starting to use, dabble in substances such as alcohol or marijuana, I strongly urge you to take intervention, steps of intervention, whether that be finding a strong support system or someone that they would listen to that would be able to counsel your child and hopefully steer them in the right direction. And if that didn't work, there are programs, which I always say is a last resort, but the Youth at Risk program that can assist you with at least having some accountability for your child, so that if they do not follow the house rules and they do not show up to school, that there's some accountability involved. But that is a last resort, but I strongly urge you to use those resources because they are available to everyone in the county.
All right, Brian, thank you for your service.
All right.
And you're a tremendous resource. And folks, this is what I'm talking about. When we return from this next break, we're going to give you some safeguards to work with. But law enforcement officers are also part of the resource. They deal with this quite often. So if you do have a problem with your child and you see, of course, Brian wouldn't do this because he's in trim fit, biting on a donut. If you got a problem, go up and talk to them. They're here to help to make this community safer. And by us supporting law enforcement, it's just one more thing that creates a better quality of life here in Calhoun County. We'll be right back. We appreciate the fact that you've joined us here at Life's Journeys with Dr. Ralph Smith, but boy, did we learn a lot in these segments. We've learned that sometimes it could be considered a disease, sometimes it's just a matter of peer pressure, sometimes it's an escape. The reasons are different, but the problems are the same. And I want to really it's so important to me to share with you how law enforcement approaches this issue and how complicated it is. And once again, Detective Brian did an excellent job explaining those issues. So let me throw a couple things out for you to think about. As I state in every program, when you're dealing with psychological issues or you're dealing with lifestyle issues, you've got to recognize, first of all, you have a problem. It doesn't do a bit of good for somebody else to bring you into my office or clinic and say, well, this is his problem or her problem. If you don't believe it's a problem, you're not going to listen to the rescue. And the rescue is referred to as the solution. So once again, if you have these tendencies, you know in your own heart you have them, seek help. Doesn't matter where you go, seek professional help. Number two, our children are some of our most valuable assets in society. This whole class of children joining the family, being raised by the family, going out on their own and getting their high school diploma or the GED, getting a trade career, going on to college. This is what we call the cycle of life. Our future is tied to that cycle of life. And one of the big detriments that we can run into is if our children come up with substance abuse issues, alcohol, marijuana. It doesn't matter the drug, it's the problem that it needs to be dealt with. And you need to deal with that problem solution. And so if you know an individual who feels, whether in the family or not, that they got a problem and they reach for help and they bring up the issue, well, we don't have the money or whatever, let's stop it now so they can have generations of success ahead of them. Now, the one issue we addressed at the very end of our segment, and this is an important one. Mom, Dad, I'm talking to you. How many of us have been involved in a car accident where we had the aftermath of severe pain? How many of us have trouble with our backs or have problems in different areas and we run off to a medical doctor and we get a prescription, the pharmacy fills it, and all of a sudden we can take that pill and we have waves of relief. And by relief, I mean absence from pain. Well, all of a sudden we find in our bodies that it needs more and more medications to have the same effect. And before you know it, you're hooked. And it's really just synthetic heroin, like the detective said. It's really another form of addiction. And just because you have a prescription or just because you have a medical doctor who says you can use it, sooner or later, if the doctor feels that you have a dependency, they're going to reduce the subscription, they're going to reduce the prescription, and they're going to reduce the amount of drugs to where sooner or later you've got to get yourself off those drugs. Why go down that road? If you are currently under a prescribed, and it doesn't matter whether it's Oxycontin or whatever the case might be, work toward the life event of reducing it on your own so that you use those pills only when you need it. If you do that, you'll avoid one of the major gateway to illegal drug use, because you can start with Oxycontin and then move on to even more serious drugs than that and end up with a criminal record and losing everything that you worked so hard for. So here's our trivia question. What drug do you feel is the most dangerous drug that people can use, and what would you do to provide a solution? Think hard about that and submit that answer to our trivia question. And when you do that, we have a nice set of prizes that will really get you excited. And as we always promise you, if you want to come on the camera and accept your prizes, we'll love to have you. So think about that, and when you see the closing billboard, you'll notice our web address, you'll notice my email address. Use those connections to give us your answer, and I hope to announce that you're one of the winners in one of our future programs. Take care of one another, and God bless.